the Biosphere and Energy. If you need energy, you go to the fridge and you pick up some food and you eat it, and that gives you energy. But where did that energy come from? Well, the things that you eat could be either animal or plant products. And where do they get their energy from? Well, animals get their energy from other animals, and some animals get their energy from plants. But the ultimate question is, where do plants get their energy from? Plants are lucky in that they make their own food in a process called photosynthesis. Now, we're not so lucky. If we want food, we have to get our moms and dads to make us food. But a plant can get its food by sitting in the sun and taking in carbon dioxide. So in this section, we're going to learn about the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is defined as a process in which solar energy is changed into chemical energy. Now, I mentioned that this happens in plants. In fact, it happens in all green plants. It also happens in other organisms that are green, and this organism is called algae. Both green plants and algae contain this chemical compound called chlorophyll. And chlorophyll is basically a pigment, like paint, like green paint. And it's responsible for giving plants their green color. The chemical process of photosynthesis can be summarized using a chemical equation. And here we have the chemical equation for photosynthesis. Now, you may not have studied chemistry before, so the concept of a chemical equation may be foreign to you. But we're going to look at it closely, and we'll see a few elements. For example, we have an arrow, and this arrow means produces. And basically, it's what the chemical reaction makes. Now, we start off with these two substances, and the starting materials in a chemical reaction are called reactants. They are the things that are going to react and make things. And in the end, we produce products. So this is the chemical formula for photosynthesis. Our reactants, or our starting materials, are CO2, and you may recognize the term CO2. CO2 is a chemical formula for carbon dioxide. The second starting material or reactant is H2O, and you may recognize the formula H2O. This stands for water. So plants undergo photosynthesis to produce energy, but they need two very important things. They need carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide they get from the atmosphere, and water they get from the hydrosphere. So plants have evolved to grow roots, and these roots tap into the soil and take out water from the soil so that they can make energy. So this chemical reaction happens, and this chemical reaction requires light. So light is not an ingredient, but it's necessary for this reaction to happen. So light energy comes from the sun, and it allows the sun to convert those starting materials into these end materials. The first product that is produced is C6H12O6, and this is the chemical formula for glucose. And glucose is a type of sugar, and that is the source of energy for all living things. The second product, or the second chemical that is produced, is oxygen. And the chemical formula for oxygen is O2. I want you to think of your own life and how these products affect your own life. Well, you need energy to go about your daily activities. And we get that energy ultimately in the form of glucose from foods that we eat. Well, this glucose came from plants. Similarly, if you take a deep breath, you know that one of the requirements for living is oxygen. So the biggest source of oxygen that we take in and use every day is from plants. So plants play an important role in our life and an important role for the entire planet. Number one, they're converting the sun's energy into a usable form of chemical energy that can be stored and used for later. So we can have a sandwich when the sun goes down. Similarly, they produce oxygen, and oxygen is necessary for all animal life. We need it to breathe. Every cell in our body depends on oxygen. So it's one of the most important chemical processes that you will study. And this process takes place in the cells of plants. In the table below, we have a summary. And this summarizes the starting materials and the end materials, or the reactants and the products of photosynthesis. So the starting materials or the reactants are carbon dioxide and water. And the products or the end materials are glucose and oxygen. So in an ecosystem, there are different levels in which organisms gain their energy, and we call these feeding levels. The scientific term for feeding levels is a trophic level. The definition of a trophic level is a category of an organism that is defined by how the organism gains their energy. So here we have a bunch of living organisms, and there's a relationship between them. And the relationship is shown or illustrated by these arrows. So there is the sun, which is not a living organism. It's an abiotic factor, but it is providing energy for the very first trophic level. And this trophic level consists of plants. We call plants primary producers. A primary producer is any organism that can produce its own food. Make sense? Another term for a primary producer is an autotroph. Primary producers are all autotrophs. The term auto means automatic, and the term troph means feeding. So they're auto-feeding. When we're hungry, we cannot just sit out in the sun and get food. We actually have to do things. We have to consume other organisms to get energy. But plants don't. They just automatically sit in the sun and make their own food. There's an arrow that goes from the plant to the grasshopper. And this tells us that energy travels from plants to grasshoppers. It also tells us that grasshoppers are eating plants. So any organism that consumes a primary producer is called a primary consumer. Now, since these types of consumers don't make their own food and they only eat plants, we call them herbivores. And a herbivore is what you would refer to as a vegetarian, only eats plants. If an organism consumes a primary consumer, it's called a secondary consumer. So these are the organisms that eat vegetarians. Another term for an organism that eats plant-eating animals is a carnivore. Now, if an organism eats but is never eaten, then it must be the top of the food chain. And this is called a top carnivore, also known as a tertiary consumer. So we have primary consumers, primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. If something doesn't make its own food, we call these organisms not autotrophs, but heterotrophs. Autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs need to consume other organisms to get energy. Hetero means other, and troph means feeding. It means they feed on other things. They can't make their own food. Now, what if an organism eats both plants and animals? We know that a herbivore eats plants and a carnivore eats animals. But what if an animal eats both plants and other animals. What do we call them? Perfect. The term is omnivore. The term omni means both. So the above relationship can be summarized in what we call a food chain. And a food chain shows the feeding relationship between organisms. So I can write the food chain for above as follows. All food chains start with a primary producer. They don't start with the sun. We're only showing the living organisms, not the abiotic factors. So the first organism in this feeding relationship is the plant. And the plant will give its energy to the grasshopper. The grasshopper will give its energy to the bird, and the bird will give its energy to the hawk. Now you can label the trophic levels. The plant is the first trophic level. The grasshopper is the second trophic level. The bird is the third, and the hawk is the fourth. Next definition is that of biomass. Biomass is all of the total mass of living organisms in a defined group or area. So if you took all of the plants and piled them all up, then you took all of the primary consumers and piled them all up, you would have all of the biomass for a living area. Here's a food pyramid that shows all of the energy that's available at each of the trophic levels, and it shows the energy that is stored in biomass at one trophic level that moves to the next trophic level through a food chain. The amount of biomass, as you can see from this diagram, decreases from one trophic level to the next. And this happens for many reasons. But if we take a look at this relationship here, if we piled up all of the plants in an ecosystem, we would have the largest mass. And the most energy in the entire ecosystem is stored here at this first trophic level. Next we have primary consumers. So we have a jackrabbit that eats the plants. If you piled up all of the jackrabbits in an ecosystem, their mass would be smaller than that of all the plants. So fewer jackrabbits eat a lot of plants. Now if we look at the long-tailed weasel, there are less long-tailed weasels than there are jackrabbits. The long-tailed weasel eats the jackrabbit, but there are more jackrabbits than there are long-tailed weasels. Makes sense. If that's a source of food, there would need to be an abundance of what you're eating. Finally, the top carnivore is the smallest amount of biomass in a food pyramid. So we can convert this in terms of energy, and we say that the most energy is in the plants. So let's say that plants have 1,000 units of energy. If we piled them all up and they equal to 1,000 energy units. Of those 1,000 energy units, only 100 energy units are transferred at the next trophic level. So by how much have we decreased? Well, 100 is 10% of 1,000. Similarly, if we look at the next trophic level, we now have only 10 units of energy. We went from 100 to 10, again decreasing to 10%. If we go from the third trophic level to the fourth, we go from 10 to 1. We see a pattern here, and for every step, we only have 10% of the energy available. And this is actually a rule inside ecosystems, and it's called the 10% rule. And it says that only 10% is available at each of the other trophic levels. You'll be required to do some calculations. One of the calculations you'll have to do is to determine the amount of energy available at each of the trophic levels. So let's do an example. Let's say that we actually measured the amount of energy that was available in the first trophic level. And that amount of energy was 5,467 joules of energy. I need to know how much of that energy will be available for the second trophic level. So the answer is it'll be 10% of it. So one simple way to do this in your head is to take the decimal place and move it to the left one digit, or by 10. So at the second trophic level, we have 546.7 joules of energy available. So first we had about 5,000. Now we have about 500. Who can guess or use calculations to tell me how much energy will be available at the third trophic level? Good. If we move the decimal place over one more, we get 54.67 joules. Finally, at the fourth trophic level, how much energy will be available? If we move the decimal place one more spot, we end up with perfect. So this is called the 10% rule. And this states only 10% of the energy present at one energy level is available to organisms at the second energy level, or the next energy level. Why does this happen? Well, why, if we have all this energy in plants, why don't the rabbits take it all? Well, not all of the energy stored inside plants is usable. For example, some of it is stored in tissues that producers or primary consumers can't eat or can't digest. So, for example, the bark of a tree is not edible, so we can't get any energy from it. So a lot of times the energy is lost in life processes that go on with that organism, such as growing and moving and becoming bigger or stronger. So for example, a herbivore may not eat the entire part of a plant. Similarly, not everything you eat is digested. If you swallow a seed, you will not digest the seed. It'll be eliminated from your body. And finally, a lot of time energy is lost in organisms in the form of heat. So these organisms generate heat to carry out their life functions.